Hello, everybody. How you doing?
Good, Jim.
Good. Listen, I want to just shamelessly give a promo at the beginning, and then you can do with it whatever you want. We had some copies of my two books sent up, and I'll just, if you're not familiar with Dead Men Talking, What Dying Teaches Us About Living, it's really an exposition and a study of the nature of man, the doctrinal distinctive, dealing with conditional immortality. Have some of you read it? Yeah. So if you haven't, if you're interested, you could purchase. I have a few copies. But much of what we're going to do in this seminar goes much more into depth in my latest work. It's my doctoral work, but I've edited it. And it's called The Alexander Antidote, Turning Conflict into a Prescription of Wholeness for the Local Church. You see, my argument, my belief is that unless you address conflict, you can't really grow from it. And so the only way to grow and have it turn into a prescription of wholeness is dealing with it. Even if you deal with it ineffectively, you're still probably going to learn something. You're certainly going to experience something. But the thing that I've done, and we have a couple churches that have done this now, and one church, Steve Lawson down in eastern North Carolina, has taken his entire diaconate through it. I designed a study guide that a leader takes their entire leadership through to proactively plan their response to conflict, particularly a difficult person. And so, because I really strongly believe that if you don't respond, you react to conflict, and that's dangerous. But if you're responding out of a biblical pattern or direction, you're much more likely to handle it in a meaningful way, in a God-honoring way. So in this book and in this study, what you do is your leaders get an opportunity to evaluate the pastor in his ability to handle conflict and respond to it appropriately. You help him or her. Also, you identify as a group in your church, once you talk about it, do we have difficult people in our church? When you talk about what that looks like. And because if you don't identify the problem, it's hard to address it. And I'll just say this, that there are many churches that years ago should have addressed the presence of a difficult person. They never did. And they allowed them to tear the church apart. And in some cases, it's worse. It's more a patriarchal or matriarchal family that has dominance and control issues. And so I just think in a God-honoring, Christ-honoring way, those kind of problems have to be addressed. Not easy, not fun, but necessary. So if you're interested, I have some copies of the Alexander Antidote. All right, did everybody get a copy of the handouts? This is yes? Yeah, okay. All right, I'm happy that you're here. I've entitled the workshop, Resolving Conflict and Living to Tell About It, because sometimes dealing with conflict can be very, very harmful to your health and the life of the church if you're not careful. But you can also emerge out of dealing with conflict in a healthy way and be stronger for it. And I think that's what we want, right? We want to be able to go through dealing with conflict and addressing issues that are difficult and be better for it all around. So that's my heart. Now I'm going to bounce, not bounce, but I'm going to bounce back between the PowerPoint and what's on your handouts. Okay? So don't get confused with that. There's not a handout that'll have all this stuff on it, but it'll all relate. And I will tell you that if you feel it was sufficient and important and helpful to you, I can send copies of this PowerPoint file to you, that if you wanted it for yourself, and that I'm glad to make available. Okay? All right. So let's turn to the first page, and the first page is the one with the title on it. And today what I want to do is just kind of walk us through some thoughts about what would we look for if we were looking at a simple guide to dealing with conflict resolution. And so we can't go in super depth, obviously, but we can hit some of the highlights, and I think there'll be enough to kind of help us. On this document, I write myth. Strong and healthy churches are always one big happy family. I have been in ministry long enough to where I've had people in the community of faith that I've pastored to think that you know, you never have problems. Just love each other. Be happy. And we got any pastors here? Is it always that way, pastors? Got any parishioners here? Is it always that way, parishioners? In fact, it's oftentimes the challenges we go through that make us healthier and stronger. So I think that's kind of a myth, you know. Strong and healthy churches are always one big happy family. No, you have to go through issues. You have to deal with them. You have to confront them. You have to wrestle with the problems. You have to pray. You have to do all those things. And that's not always comfortable. So I suggest that that's a myth. I also suggest that a myth that's present among us today is mature Christian leaders never have disputes. Boy, you've never worked on a church staff, if you believe that, because one of the powerful things about a church staff is we bring different personalities, different skills, different strengths, different hopes, different dreams, and yet there are threads of agreement that bind us together. And certainly I would think that would be being committed to the Great Commission and these kinds of things, the Great Commandment, and they bind us together, and we blend all of that, you know, the talents, because, you know, at ACGC, I'm different than Justin. I'm different than Jeff. And they're different than me, and I'm different than Ron and Don and Richard. I bring my gifts and strengths and talents and struggles, weaknesses. They bring theirs. But together, we're able to work effectively, I think. And where we aren't, we work on it. And where we don't work on it, it hurts us. There's nothing worse in the context of a church ministry or a staff or anything where you recognize there's a problem and you're unwilling to address it. It can destroy you. So the fact that you're a leader and you disagree with someone, or you're working on a team, you have different perspectives, the strength is, in my mind, your willingness on both sides to sit down and to work on that issue, and together ask God for a solution and bring all that you have to the table to help you get through it. That's really a great experience. That's a great experience when that happens. So you know, those are a couple myths. There's some other things we could say, but we'll move on. So church health, here, all for you type A personalities, here's your first blanks. Church health isn't defined by the absence of conflict, but how it is responded to and resolved. Church health isn't defined by the absence of conflict, but how it is responded to and resolved. How many of you have been in both situations? You've been in situations where there's a conflict that exists and it's never been addressed. You been in those? What's that like? You were just saying hello, weren't you, there, Frank? Other words, what? Did I hear another word somebody said? Walking on eggshells. Dreadful. Haven't you ever sat at the table with a leadership team or any contact where you know there's conflict and nobody's willing to address it? The tension, the carefully guarded words, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Now, let me ask you, have you ever been in a scenario or a situation where conflict exists and the people that you're working with are dealing with it in a healthy, clear communication kind of way, and how does that feel? That's good, isn't it? You don't know that you're around. I've been in both. I'm sure that you've been in both. So a healthy church, and I think that helps us as we lead ministries. We're not looking for a perfect church, but we're looking for a church that follows biblical principles and trusting the Holy Spirit to lead us through that jungle, that mess, and honoring Him all along the way. And so I think if we do that, even though our situation may be very, very, very difficult and uncomfortable, we can have some sense of pleasure that we're listening to the Lord and we're following, but we're not doing our own thing. We're working with people in a healthy manner. And I think that's partially a sign of at least a church that's headed in the direction of health. I really do. The difficult thing is it can last for a long time. And we have to have patience and persistence. All right, so let me give you some basic thoughts that help guide us when we deal with conflict. And the first thing I would say is that we must anticipate conflict. Andy Rice said he was going to come in my workshop and about halfway through jump up and say, "I don't agree with you." And I said, "That's fine, because I anticipate conflict." But in all seriousness, where are you living that when you challenge real issues and you think you'll never have a problem? What rock have you been under? Today, even in the life of the church, there are about, if you got 10 avid Christians in the room, there are 14 opinions. Seriously, there are just ideas and perspectives that are influenced by so many things. If you anticipate conflict or dissonance of opinion and ideas, isn't that more of a refreshing position to be in? Not that you want it, not that you're asking for it, but you're not shocked by the fact that somebody raises an objection. And an effective leader is thinking through of the most common kind of objections that they're going to get. And you want to make a plan. You go, well, what might be some of the reactions to this? And if you think through that, at least you are thinking in a healthy manner. So we anticipate conflict. We also, number two, we must prepare for conflict. We must prepare for conflict. And there are a lot of aspects to this idea of preparation. For me, one of the most important aspects of preparing for conflict is time with the Lord. It's not easy, no matter how highly you might think of yourself, and you need to read Romans 12 if you do, because it tells us not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought. But we really need to spend time with the Holy Spirit and ask the Holy Spirit and the Lord to just help us not overreact, not make a mountain out of a molehill, not to judge, not to make premature judgments. One of the biggest problems in conflict resolution is that many leaders jump to conclusions before they ever look at the evidence. You automatically assume that you understand why Alan has taken the position he's taking. You may be light years away from what he's thinking. And out of respect, you ought to let Alan be able to share and then be able to ask questions. Am I understanding you properly, Alan? Is this what bothering you? And he gets the opportunity to clarify. But a lot of times, we assume that we understand, and in a little bit I'm going to show you something on the page of how that progresses negatively when you move through levels of conflict. And I think it'll be even more clear. But we must prepare. We must pray. We must think through issues. We must clarify why we're taking the position we're taking. And not so that we can justify it, but so we can explain it and communicate it. And walk through, if I'm thinking this way, does it make sense that I'm moving in this direction? Those kinds of things. We all do it, right? Maybe not as intentionally as we ought, but we all do it. We think like that. So we must anticipate, we must prepare, and we must respond to conflict. One of the mistakes that I made early on in dealing with conflict and growing and learning and studying is that I allowed potential things that were going to cause conflict to germinate far too long before I dealt with it. Because things don't tend to get better. If there's a reason for a potential conflict and a problem, if you don't address it in some way, what are you asking for? Trouble. And what I found is that the longer we allow that to happen, the more unclear the real issue becomes. Let me explain what I mean. Because the farther you remove yourself from it, it's hard to remember what somebody said or what was I thinking, or did something happen in my life that day and I didn't remember how influential that was. And so now you're far removed and you end up arguing or getting upset about something that really wasn't at the heart of the matter. So we need to respond to it. Now the question is, how do we respond? What's appropriate in terms of a response? Now, I don't know about you. Do you respond all the same way to problems? Some people do. They have a pattern of how they respond. For example, this happens in marriage. When something happens in a marriage and they get upset, one person, the husband, may be one who responds by walking out and slamming the door and not talking to his wife for 2 hours. That's a typical response mechanism. The wife may do something else. She shuts down, she won't talk. So if you typically respond in the same way every time, you're going to typically get what? Same result. So, and personality-wise, if you know a person is somebody that can't handle that response, doesn't it make sense to perhaps find a better way to talk to them, to deal with the issue? I think so. Okay, so must anticipate, we must prepare, we must respond. And this is one that will be helpful to us. It's not one we always think about, and that is we must accept different outcomes. We must accept different outcomes. And what I mean by that is that if you go in and so predetermine in your mind what the outcome must be, you're going to be in trouble. Because the resolution to a problem may be something that you didn't expect. And so if you go in and say, this is exactly, and so, here Ed starts acting a different way and he doesn't respond the way I want to him, and I'm getting more perturbed because why? I've already predetermined how we ought to resolve this problem. I mean, Ed's not really a part of it. I'm not allowing him to be. So I have to be willing to allow the fact that there may be an outcome that comes through our working together that's different than what I intended, but it's the resolution to the problem. So we must be willing to accept different outcomes when that happens. Not saying that it will happen, every time, but. And then finally, we must focus on the future after the conflict is resolved. If a problem is brought to a point of resolution, we ought to be able to move on. Don't you think, Charlie? Now, I've had opportunity to deal in my job here, in my ministry, with churches and situations where I've made a distinction between reconciliation and restoration. And I even talk about this in the book. But I got some real-life experiences. Some people think that reconciliation, that's it. When I think of reconciliation, I'm thinking in some situations where there's confession and forgiveness and acceptance of that and everything, and we're reconciled. But restoration is the ability to move on from that point. Biblically, can't you think of an example? 1 Corinthians 5, man has his father's wife, stepmother. Paul excommunicates him, put him out of the church. 2 Corinthians 2, he says, I think he's experienced enough punishment. I think he ought to come back. You ought to accept him. Don't allow Satan to get his foot in this because of your unwillingness to accept him, to restore him back into fellowship. We had about 25, 30 people leave the church at West Jacks, where I pastored for 18 years before I took this role. And they went off and started a little church, and it didn't work out, so they wanted to come back. And they sent a letter, can we come back lock, stock, and barrel? And I said, well, I'd like to talk to each family and everything, but, we'd willingly. And I had people come to me, you're going to let them back in the church? You're going to let those two ladies back in the church? You better watch out for them. They are trouble. And there was another guy and praise the Lord, some of those relationships were the best for the next 15 years in my life in ministry. But they might say we reconcile, but I even doubt that. But they certainly weren't ready to restore them. Definitely not. They weren't ready to focus on the future and move on and learn from their experiences. And how damaging that can be. How damaging that can be if we're not willing to do that. I'm presently, and I won't talk about any, but I've been working with some contemporary issues in the Advent Christian denomination churches where reconciliation and restoration is absolutely essential. And I'll tell you at the point where you will really realize this is important is when you've sinned and you've done something that's damaged your relationships and the trust level between you and other people and wanting to get back into a proper fellowship, then you'll realize how difficult this can be. How difficult this can be. And so we want to have the heart of Christ in the midst of all this. And I know it's hard, we're human, but I believe that the God is capable of helping us, don't you? So very important. We must focus on the future, be able to move forward. And we remember that stuff because why? We learn from it, right? We hope we learn from it. But we've got to move on. Okay, I want to give you some of this. If I turn it on. This way I might ask a few of you to read a couple things, okay, as we go through this real quickly. Ed, go ahead, buddy.
2 Corinthians 5:16-20. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God making his appeal through us.
Now, I recognize this, that first and foremost, this relates to sharing the gospel, proclamation of Christ, bringing people to a point of belief in Christ. But a subsidiary aspect of this is that Christians ought to be agents of reconciliation and not destruction, right? You know, some of us over the years have had the gift of destruction. You know, we got pastors that have gone in and just ruined churches by the way they've gone about the ministry. And we have people that lead boards and people that serve that just have done more harm than good. I mean, it's one thing to lead somebody to Christ, but we need to be reconcilers. We need to learn how to build healthy relationships with people. Very important. Alan?
Reconciliation is something we can't make, do, or create like a milkshake. That is, you can't make it without the right ingredients.
The right ingredients. What are some ingredients to being able to be a part of the reconciliation process? One that comes to mind for me is humility. I mean, nobody died and made you king or queen. Understanding. Grace, patience, forgiveness. You know, so you know, we don't just we have to really be intentional about this, and we have to have the right ingredients. Reconciliation is not telling Bob, okay, I'll reconcile you if you do this and this and this and this and this and this, and you know, you check off the list. That's not really a picture of reconciliation, is it? Somebody read this. Charlie, can you?
Theologically, reconciliation is a gift. Our work in conflict management cannot be the creation of reconciliation. Our work must be to seek to create an environment in which the possibility of reconciliation is increased.
Wow. How much more effective do you think we would be in our church boards and our church ministries and everything when we look at ministry, if we worked on creating a healthy environment where reconciliation and these kind of things could take place rather than getting on each side of the table and fighting each other? Think we'd be more effective? You can almost feel it when you get into a problem in the life of the church, the line being drawn right between all the people, the adherents to this view, the adherents to that view, and the leaders are trying to go, oh boy, The ability to have meaningful, healthy, loving, humble conversations with people who hold a different view from us is a missing ingredient a lot in churches and businesses and organizations. Of course, in an organization and business, the CEO just fires you. You know, sometimes that's the way it's dealt with. And certainly that's not necessarily healthy. Okay, all you wannabe readers, those that you, way in the back, I don't even know if you can see it that clearly, but somebody read that for us.
Theology shapes the way we respond to conflict. Your assessment of the world will affect your level of fright. It will affect your ability to cope well in a conflicted situation.
Biblical worldview. God's in control. He gives direction. He values people. You know, your whole perspective on the world and theology and a right relationship with God will impact how you respond and deal in a situation of conflict. Because I can tell you, I remember we used to, when I was at Berkshire, I did some marriage assessment with our young couples, and they'd come in and I'd say to them, I'd say, well, why do you want to get married? And they'd look at each other and one of them would say, because we love each other. And I would say, and I said, now you don't believe it right now. And I'll probably get some amens here. I don't know from whom. But you don't believe it right now, but there's going to come a time when that cute little old doll sitting next to you, you're going to want to knock her head off. from an emotional standpoint. You're not gonna like her. You're not gonna want to cuddle with her. And what is it that's gonna make you hang in there? Well, it's commitment, folks. When I started the class, I used to have them super glue, 2 5 by whatever that is, 4 by 6, 5 by 10 or whatever, index cards, and put it in their book. And then about halfway through the class when we talked about divorce, I asked them to pull it out and take it, and I wanted both of them in the same condition they were before they glued them. I mean, you know the result, right? And I said, when you're committed, that's commitment. That's what's going to keep you together. Love is not going to be on the forefront of your mind. Because love isn't really an emotion that we transfer to a person of affection. But commitment, the commitment we made. That's why they use it in the marriage ceremony, right? In what? Sickness and health, and some of you have forgotten. What was it? Richard? Anybody remember rich or poor? Remember that one? Why is it we always experience one side of that more than that? No, just kidding. But your assessment of the world, the value you place on things, drive how you act in situations. It drives how you act, how you respond, the decisions you make. So here we go. This is what I was telling you a while ago that I think be held. Levels of conflict. And then I'm going to identify the transition. Problems to solve, disagreement, contest or contest, fight or flight, and intractable situations. Now, I think you're going to find this helpful. I really hope so. It was when first time I ever engaged with this. Now, this is kind of how the levels, that's just another picture of what I just wrote for you. Now, see if you can track through this. What we call level 1, problems to solve. Actual differences exist. People understand one another, but have conflicting goals, values, needs, action plans, or information. Anger is usually short-lived. Long-term anger is usually more common with higher levels of conflict. The objective is to fix the problem. Resolving the conflict is usually collaborative. We work together. Language tends to be clear, specific, oriented to the here and now. How many of you can recognize those kinds of problems? Don't you recognize there are some problems that come up in your sphere of influence that aren't that big a deal? You could sit across and talk to me, Ed, about something that's not that big a deal. It's a problem to solve. Well, you know, I'm not going to get angry about it. The objective is just to fix it. Something that we call a simple problem. You all have that in mind. You're familiar with that, okay? Disagreement, level 2.
Disagreement, level 2. More difficult than level 1, but not at the degree of win or lose. Less concerned with solving problems than with self-protection. A new concern enters the picture, myself. I want to solve the problem, but I don't want to get hurt. I want to come out looking good. Shrewdness and calculation enter the picture. People call on friends to discuss the problem and ask for advice. Planning strategies to deal with the conflict. The language shifts from specific to general. They shift from naming people to saying some people are saying this or that. Hostile humor, put-downs are common at level 2.
How many can say they've experienced this? Have you ever had somebody come to you and they say, boy, there's some people, there's a problem. Well, what is it? And they say, well, there's a lot of people that feel this way. Well, who are they? Oh, well, I could never tell you who they are. But there's some people. And sometimes I've found it's just them. But at least what this level 2 disagreement says, that they are now discussing it with other people. Self-protection, less concern with solving problems than with self-protection. A new concern enters the picture, myself. Do you notice what's changed up in level 1? It's not so much about me or Ed or Alan or whoever's, we're not worried about our reputation. We're not concerned or anything. But now we're moving over to an area where I may come out of this looking badly. I got a little protection concerns here. Hostile humor, have you ever heard that? You get in circles and a little hostile humor takes place and everybody, but you hear it. You sense it. And again, remember, if you tolerate this stuff and don't address it, it only gets worse. What? It only gets worse. Let's go to the third one.
Contest level 3. Win-lose dynamics appear at level 3. This is a fairly high level of conflict, but falls short of hostilities and the agonies of fight-flight. The objectives of level 3 shift from protection to winning. At this point, there are usually more than one problem to fix. Factions often arise at this level. Emerging factions are looking for victories, for evidence their group is in the ascendancy, that they have more power or control than others. The win-lose dynamic is in effect. The language of level 3 is characterized by distortion. Research has shown that at this level, perceptual distortions is a problem at level 3 between individuals or groups, over generalizations, assumptions, etc.
You been there? When you get in the midst of conflict and you reach what they call level 3, the objectives of level 3 shift from protection to winning. You're just not concerned about protecting yourself. You are now concerned about winning the problem, the argument. Winning in the context of a church means kind of what? And having the church be run by your expectations on this particular issue, I mean, it can become even broader than that, right? And so, distortion. Have you ever seen this? Well, in the conversation and the problem as it unfolds, communication becomes laden with distortions. You know, every time the pastor gets up, he says something about this. What's that, possibly? A distortion. Every time he gets up, he doesn't talk about this. And so distortion. So here's what has to happen. We have to be able to maintain a clear understanding of what is and what isn't happening. We need to learn to listen. You can go every day to a special seminar on how to speak better. When's the last time you went to one on learning to listen better? And somebody said that's why the Lord gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. And honestly, listening effectively and carefully is a real gift, because we often make assumptions that are dangerous, right? You've heard about the guy who was so proud he was putting down his carpet for his wife, and he never really done that before and everything, and she was in the kitchen, and he's pulling up all his tools and everything. He looks for a little sledgehammer thing he had. And he looked over there right in the entrance of the kitchen, and he saw this lump in the carpet. I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Hey, honey, you see my little sledgehammer? Well, no, dear. So he went out in the garage, he got a big sledgehammer. And he came in there, and he pounded that sucker. He just beat it to pieces, got it down where it looks good. All of a sudden, she came out. He says, I haven't seen your sledgehammer, but have you seen our parrot? Now, you know what you just did?
Assumption.
You assumed that it must have been the parrot. Assumptions can kill you. How many times, there have been times over my history where I've made an assumption, premature judgment, and it's gotten me in trouble. Honestly, have any of you jumped to conclusions and had assumptions got you in trouble? So we try to discern, we try to make wise decisions, but we don't jump to conclusions and have assumptions that aren't grounded in fact or truth, right? So this is a one that we need to pay attention to.
Fight, flight, level 4. The only option at this point is the elimination of the other party. The objectives of level 4 shift from wanting to win to wanting to hurt and or get rid of the others. Rather than the good of the individual or group, the good of the subgroup is the priority. As the level of the factions solidify, clear lines mark who is in and who is out of each of the groups. Language gels to ideology. People talk more about principles than issues. They speak of right, truth, justice, the American way. Called fight flight because this level brings out the primitive survival responses of both defendants and proponents. Often a detachment takes place from the other side, which prevents an awareness of the pain being caused to others.
You're starting to get separation. You're starting to get the unwillingness to sit down and talk with anybody, to wrestle with an issue. And so it becomes two distinct groups. It sounds kind of cruel, the elimination of the other party. But basically, if you've reached this point, you want very little to do with the other people. And the only way you're going to bring health to your church is what? Get rid of them. We take this church over. It's got to be my way. It's got to be this way, and there's a lot of unfairness because we're just lumping everybody into the same bag of trouble. And actually, that one statement that they say in there, the leader kind of steps to the forefront. Sometimes when this happens, there are even people in each faction group who would rather look at it more soundly, but they don't. Why? There's pressure. There's coercion. Are you part of, don't you agree what we declare here? I've seen that. And perhaps you have as well. Well, as if you thought it couldn't get any better. Level 5 is the final level.
Intractable situations, level 5. When a conflict reaches this level, it is unmanageable. Conflict that has reached this level cannot be handled by the participants. They are conflict run amok. The objective of level 5 is to destroy the others. The opposition is seen as harmful to the organization and society at large. Parties usually see themselves as part of an eternal cause, fighting for universal principles. Since the ends are all important, they believe that they are compelled to fight.
Now, I'm not a politician, and I'm not going to go down that road, but do you see any symptoms of this stuff in Washington? All right, let's jump back to the page, okay? I want to bring you up to a point where I want to ask you to do some discerning in your own context. So we get back to when dealing with church conflict. There are a number of authors I've read recently over the past few years that have really helped me, and one of the areas that they've written on is this matter of culture. So I've kind of changed my approach when I go in and work with a church with strategic planning and these kind of things, because a lot of churches and organizations try to do strategic planning without addressing or understanding their culture. And there's a couple authors that have written pretty effectively, and later I can bring that up for you. But one of them makes the argument that if you go through strategic planning and you set the path for your organization, and everybody says, yeah, we agree. But if the culture of your church is toxic because there's the presence of enough people or viewpoints that are against that, you will never achieve your goal. You can have it in gold embossed frames on every wall in your church, but if there's a culture in your church, and you know what I find? I find that many times, the closer you are to the culture, the more difficult it is to discern it. I've sat with church staffs, and I know enough about the church situation, and I've done some interviewing and blah, 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 and some of them are oblivious to the presence of toxicity in their culture. I mean, it's amazing. And one church particularly that I worked with, this was a really interesting thing we did at Garner. It took them quite a while with Kenny to wrestle with the fact that they did have a culture, that there were some things there fighting against them moving forward, but they've wrestled with it and they've addressed it and they've done a great job. But, we always want to pat ourselves on the back and think we're a little better than we are. Oh, that doesn't exist here. But you can be so much a part of that culture that you don't see it. Like it's a small example would be, we're such a friendly church. The problem is they're only friendly to each other. Visitors come in and nobody speaks to them. But we're such a friendly church. That's just a small tip of the iceberg kind of experience for a lot of churches. So we must remember that every church functions within a given culture. Now that's culture as we typically understand culture. But let's go on. Culture includes the totality of life patterns, language, religion, literature, machines and inventions, arts, crafts, architect, decor, dress, laws, customs, marriage and family structures, government, institutions, plus the peculiar and characteristic ways of thinking and acting. I came from Berkshire Christian College. I was the dean of students, and they closed operations in '87. I left in '85 as the dean of students. There was 1 year. I came back and spoke at baccalaureate. Came back. The church suspended the school suspended operations. I went from New England. Now, first of all, I'm a Southern boy. I went to New England for a number of years. I married a girl from Vermont, and I went to Portland, Oregon. where slow is their middle name. Laid back is a part of their culture. And I'm a more proactive type A personality, and they just kind of treated me like, you know, it was almost you could hear them say, just slow down there, feller. We'll get there eventually. Don't get in such a hurry. You know what that does to a type A? Pam. I mean, seriously, until I was able and willing to look at that culture and figure out how I could function healthily in that situation, I was struggling. I think I learned some things and grew out of that. But boy, you better understand your culture, because you could be fighting all your life and never get anywhere. Do you have a sense of that culture? So we're going to kind of doubly apply it to the church context. Next week, say a society is defined as a self-perpetuating group who share a geographical territory and a culture. So kind of a smaller segment of a broader culture, and interesting things can develop in those that culture and in those societies. A culture, next, can be broken down into smaller groups that are similar in many ways to the larger society, yet distinguishable from it. In other words, you can be a part of a Midwest culture and be a smaller segment of it and reflect some of the larger cultural norms, but have some that are peculiar to where you are. And so it's very interesting. Very interesting to see that dynamic. When you go into a place and you're Southern, not every Southerner is the same. Of course, most Southerners are Yankees. But, and I'm not joking. You go to Florida, I mean, it's predominantly Michiganians or New England people. But my wife, you know, she's had some from Rutland, Vermont. And, you know, it gets 75 degrees and she wants to put on a sweater. I'm like, what? She's become acclimated to the physical culture of living in Florida. Of course, I said, what did you do growing up? She says, I was cold then too. So I guess it doesn't matter. But, you know, when you start then thinking expectations, lifestyles, patterns of thinking, all this kind of stuff. So if you stay there long enough and you're in a particular area, you get acclimated to that particular segment of your culture, the society. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Within these, the subcultures, these smaller groups within a culture are called subcultures. Within these subcultures, a person learns how to behave in a given situation and eventually expects other members of that society to behave in the same way. These expected patterns of behavior are called norms. I just had an interesting experience. Shelley and I flew to Philadelphia and went to see our son who lives in Brooklyn, goes to NYU, and we went to Pennsylvania. And there's an interesting kind of subculture that lives in eastern Pennsylvania. You know what it is? And they have norms that are peculiar to them and separate, and they live, and they're on the border of some of the cultural, societal issues, but they live as a community. They have certain expectations and everything, and they stay pretty consistent to it. In fact, they even have a thing in their belief where I think you're a teenager, 16 or whatever it is, that you get released so you can go out and see if you want to stay Amish or join the world. And a lot of them come back and commit themselves to that. So let's tie it to churches. We have churches all across the Advent Christian denomination that live in, let's say, for the Southern culture, Southern region. And they're not all the same. There is a wide spectrum of differences in how they do ministry, and a lot of it has to do with leadership. But they're not all identical, they're the same. They become kind of subcultures. And in some churches, there are expectations and norms that I don't see in some of our other churches, even in that same culture, the Southern culture. Would that be true in New England? No. No, it's a serious question. I think I know the answer. I think living in a rustic county and being a part of State Road and all these churches up there, there's a lifestyle, there's a cultural expectation, there's a mindset that's quite different than living in Haverhill or Lenox or East Norwalk. Do you agree? So ministry takes on a kind of a life of itself, so to speak, in those particular contexts, those cultures, those subcultures, and particularly with those norms. You might find it interesting to go back into your culture and say, what are the norms that have been created here?
It's like that young man that we saw in the video that was
Ashley, yeah.
and went out to wherever it was. The culture was so different.
Absolutely.
He had to acclimate.
And they had some adjustments to do with that, deal with that. So, okay, so let me move on very quickly. Pastoral, in the church, we see conflict how? Pastoral experience suggests at least 5 what I call context, plural, of influence. Context of influence that exists within the local church. And here they are. Historical, you might have to write small. Historical, familial, family. Historical, familial, pastoral, theological, and sociological-geographical. So historical, familial, pastoral, theological, and sociological-geographical. It's on the other page. Now, what are these? Let me just quickly tell you, because we're running out of time. We got a lot accomplished before then. I first did a study in Jacksonville, Florida, in Duval County, and the 8 churches that were a part of that community when I was there, and not when I came to pastor West Jackson, all 8 churches began as a result of splits. Do you think that has anything to do with history? I asked, one of the questions I asked, and I write about in Alexander Antidote, is where do difficult people come from? Well, one place they come, these are the context of influence. They come from the historical dynamic of your church, which is part of the culture. And so I've dealt with people in Jacksonville who were a part of 2 or 3 splits. And their thinking patterns and the way they behave and act and the reasons they do stuff and the people they don't want anything to do about is because of what? Because of some of the history they've gone through. Familial. Churches have dominant families. And if any one of those is a patriarchal or matriarchal figure that everybody kind of looks to, and then they pass it on in their family, can be very tough. Now, when I was in Oregon, I'm not trying to stir trouble. Of course, this is a good reason to say this. I went to Oregon and discovered that there was a significant presence of people who did not believe in the triune nature of God. I'm strongly a Trinitarian. Well, it was familial. I never understood how deeply it was familial. They asked me finally to teach on, so I'm teaching John 1, Philippians 2, all these kind of things. And I would say to them, now, how does this passage teach what you say the Bible teaches? And they'd say, well, my grandfather said, and I said, with all due respect, I don't care what Grandpappy said. What does the Bible say? Of course, that surely endeared me to them. They loved me. It caused all kinds of problems for me and for the church. I went back to perform a wedding of a couple that when I left the church, they left the church. In fact, when I was at WACA that Greg went to, I was out there. I saw her again. But by the way, a couple years ago, I was at Colton and gone out there and did some teaching for him and everything and shared some reports. And this lady, 25 years later, comes and sits down by me on a little pew in the back. And she went ballistic because during that teaching that I did, her older son and wife came to me and said, we've never heard this teaching before, but we think it's biblical. But we could never admit it publicly because our mother would disown us. And she would. So this is the lady that comes back and sits down in this little pew. And I thought I should put on my armor right And she kind of exhales. And I said, Joyce, you okay? She says, I'm just finding myself hanging on every word you're saying. To hang me? Or to literally. She says, oh, it's amazing what 25 years will do for you. But I thought, oh my goodness, she would disown us? And I found that familial environment is a very dangerous one. They would never say it publicly because she would disown us. Pretty strong, right? Pastoral. They had 5 pastors previous to me that did things differently than I did, and then combined the next one. Theologically, a number of them were non-trends. They came out of Oklahoma. One of them is people that somebody that all of you would know. And he was a dear man, a good teacher in many ways, but I think he was wrong. Sid Hatch. Sid Hatch, his daughter Phyllis married Tim Chapman, who was a part of this church. You want to see how it connects? Tracy, his brother, he went on the trip with Roland Griswold. Remember years ago they sent this group of 25, 30 Advent Christian kids to India, and we built the church over there, and Roland directed. It had Tracy Chapman and Seth Hickel, and Tracy was a part of it. He came home. Grandpa Chapman says, if you go to Oregon Bible College in Illinois, which is belligerently non-Trinitarian, I'll pay your way. He was headed to Berkshire, where they decided that if you go to Berkshire, you turn out to be what? A Trinitarian. He goes, marries a girl who came out, and when I came to be the pastor, she was the worship leader. And Bob, you'll appreciate this. She bought sheet music, and if it said anything about the Trinity, she marked it out and wrote it in her own words. She and I had a little go-to-meeting. And we had to work on that. Familial, pastoral, theological, and then geographical, sociological. Where do they come? If you have a concept of what the church is all about and it differs from the biblical picture, you're in trouble. I sat down with the chairman of the board when I came to Berkshire, West Jackson. I said, Alex, what is your perspective of the church? Well, it's a place where Christians go and meet and have church, and we help them. And I went away from that meeting and I go, dear Lord, we're in trouble if that's your perspective of what the church is. So a lot of times we have conflict in the church because we're dealing with people that have no clue with what the church is all about and what God intended for it. So those are things that I write about in the book in depth and just to help you there. So quickly, conflict is experienced in at least 3 ways. Interpersonally, some people just can't get along with themselves. They have problems. They have reasons for the conflict they cause. Intrapersonally, they can't work with other people. And substantively, that's on the back page, substantively. So when we talk about substantive conflict, there are at least 4 types of substantive conflict. And here I want you to write these in real quickly. Oh boy. You ready? Conflict over facts. Can you resolve conflict over facts? Where are we on the levels? 1, because why? You can check the facts. Ed and I can sit and look at the facts. Well, I thought I was right, but I was wrong. Ed, you're right. Problem solved, right? If it's done in the right way. Conflict over facts. How many of you ever gotten a little bit of skirmish at times about facts? You know? It's possible, but it's not a deal killer. Conflict over methods or means. How many of you have ever gotten in trouble in the life of the church because people got in arguments and discussions about how you should do something? Never did it that way before. Where are we? Where are we on? Remember the levels? 2, heading toward 3, maybe. You're protecting because who taught you? It may be a familial thing. Who taught you this is how you do it? Pastor friend or somebody that you respect and so forth, that kind of stuff. Now you move to winning because if you start attacking my grandfather and you start cutting into that turf, we're rapidly moving up the level ladder. But you can see where you are. These are helpful tools to kind of see where you are in the process at times. So, methods and means. Conflict over ends or goals. Ever had any problems over that? What are we doing this for? Why are we doing it? What do we hope to get out of it? How do we know the end of it? When will, that kind of stuff? Ever had any of that stuff?
Why isn't that part of 1?
Which one? The level one?
Ends are, no. Fact. Why isn't that an example of an actual dispute?
Well, I think a fact is different than a goal. I mean, they're both. I mean, in the sense that a goal is a fact that you've agreed upon, but a fact is something like basically just informationally based. Charlie, the church was not founded in 1872. Just deal with it. But I find out that it is 1872. We can resolve that. But the goal has a little bit more what of it in it. More personal, because you determined that the program the reason we established this program was to reach this goal. That's not it. Are you an idiot? No, Pastor, you are. I've seen arguments in churches over confused goals. Does that help? I mean, in some cases they might be very, very close, indiscernible, but I think they are different. Now, the last one is and this is where it gets really rocky, conflict over values. People do what they value. They may say this or that, but they do what they value, what they think is important, what drives them. Take your other sheet, okay? And if you'll permit me to go 5 minutes or so over, I want to get this for you. I don't have my other sheet. I want to see. Can't remember how I laid this out. What I'd like you to do at some point is to describe the culture of your ministry situation. Just some bullet points that represent what it's like. Explain the subculture in which you function. It may be the Sunday school or youth ministry department or youth ministry. No. List any identifiable norms within your subculture. Kind of get a picture of what you're dealing with. And then if you are thinking of a particular conflict situation that you're dealing with, circle those that are relevant to your situation. Do you sense that you're in this mess because, let's say you're the youth pastor now and they've had a youth pastor that's been there 25 years and they did everything this way, and now you're suggesting that maybe we should do some things, what? A little differently? Where did that come from? Is it because it's also supported by the pastor in tandem with this person who's been there for 30 years? Not that they were wrong, but it's different now. Kind of get a feel for what you're dealing with. Describe the issue. And then when you get down to your conflict, what is it? That you're just having trouble now internally? You're wrestling with what this ministry should be like? Are you disagreeing now with your pastor about this? Is it a substantive issue, and what are we asking then? Is it over methods or means? That is how you do youth ministry? Is that possible in this day and age? People look differently as how you do youth ministry. Or is it values? What do you value? What are you trying to give these kids? There was a youth pastor that changed the youth ministry. It's a big church, and I won't go into it, but he changed his approach, and they used to take the kids halfway around the world. It was a very affluent church. And he realized that these kids were immature, spiritual brats, and real brats from an affluent standpoint. So he changed the whole system of how you qualify for going on this mission trip that they raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. Guess who attacked him? Parents. You're not going to tell me that my kid's going to go. They've been in this youth group for 10 years. And he began to try to wrestle with the issues of, well, why are we sending them? Goal. But it got up to the point of what they valued. Do you see how that stuff can it can just snowball? So where are you? Are you at the point of fight, flight, disagreement? Have you reached a point where something's really got to happen? And then you can work out a plan of action. This could be a very good tool for you. Let me, where are we here? Okay, 4 guidelines for dealing with conflict. Let me quickly give those to you and then try to wrap up in just a few minutes. Now, these are 4 guidelines that are present and that I work on and write in the book. When you're dealing with conflict, number 1, seek balance. Seek balance. Be very careful to land on one side of the issue too prematurely. Seek understanding. Seek perspective. Seek balance. Very, very critical. Number 2, seek God in prayer. Seek God in prayer. When I first did my doctoral work, there were about 5 books that said more than just a token comment on the role of prayer in conflict, they would say things like, well, of course a leader would pray. But the Bible, and the New Testament particularly, is very clear about the role of prayer. Very clear. Has some powerful principles in the New Testament, in Pauline literature particularly, about the role of prayer. And one of the things that I got to quickly tell you, I experienced in this whole learning process was I was reading 1 Timothy 4, and I was sitting at the table with Ray Marco. Anybody know Ray? My brother-in-law. He was married to my sister for 34 years before she died of breast cancer. And they were sitting there praying. They prayed this prayer in 1 Timothy 4. Everything God created is good and acceptable, especially that which is sanctified by the Word of God and prayer. And so imagine, Pam, I'm in the midst of writing my dissertation, doing all this and working with this. And I'd come out of the Trinitarian issue, I'm dealing with all this difficult person stuff and everything. And I said, dear God, tell me that doesn't include difficult people. You mean I've got to pray for them? And when you talk about sanctity, it's a matter of setting something out apart for very personal use and holy use in the presence of God. You mean, Lord, and this is where really dealing with premature judgment helps you. If you can have sanctifying prayer, it sets the person off in God's presence and keeps your hands off of them for a while. Very powerful biblical principles. But then you get 1 Corinthians 7, and Paul talks about the two unbelievers, and one becomes a believer. And follow that, read it. He later says, how do you know, woman? How do you know, man? You're not bound, but stay there, because how do you know that your presence will not sanctify that husband or father or the children? Powerful principle, this sanctifying type of prayer. So seek balance, seek God in prayer, and then very quickly, seek reconciliation and seek restoration. And what we need are more transforming leaders. We need leaders like you folks who are willing to hang in the midst of the battle and move toward restoration and wholeness. So many pastors and leaders bail out, go to another church, find another church, and what they really do is bring their problems with them, and it just gets worse. So 2 minutes, you can leave if you need to. I'm gonna go on. Too many of our schools have focused their teaching on what to think rather than how to think. Few people have a strategy for solving problems. Few churches have a strategy for solving problems. That's why the study guide with the leader, of taking leaders through it so they can think ahead, that's the thought behind that. Life is indeed a process. Life is never-ending, always changing series of continual problems. There are no typical problems. Each is unique, but we can apply a deliberate and systematic approach to solving problems that still saves plenty of room for spontaneity and flexibility. If you have a pulse, you have problems. Which means that everyone is a problem solver. The greatest problem we share to a greater or lesser degree is a profound misunderstanding of the positive purpose of problems. That's why my book says, turning conflict into a prescription of wholeness for the local church, because churches that avoid their problems are just going to continually, perpetually have problems because they don't deal with them. Then you try to get a pastor that comes in there and tries to deal with the problem. This is good. These are kind of approaches to problem solving. Simplistic, immature process that often ignores important information. People say, well, just turn it over to God. He'll solve it. These problems must be because you have sin in your life. I was in an avid Christian church years ago. I was dating Shelley in a little Bible study, and a lady was coughing, sneezing, honking, blowing, and everything. He stopped the Bible study and said, ma'am, before we go forward, could you just share with us tonight what sin is in your life? I was a pastoral major at Berkshire. I almost had a heart attack. I heard that. I could not believe that. And then the typical one that really has power, if you only tithed. Complexity. Thinkers often gather so many conflicting details that they cannot organize it into one encompassing statement. They get too easily sidetracked. I work with pastors who they have so much information, it's hard to even figure out what's going on. They just analyze it to death instead of trying to get the basics and go from there. Yes, I did go to Harvard, and I remember dealing with a case study similar to yours in one of my psychology classes. Now, if you could explain to me your feelings at the age of 4. And then profound simplicity. Thinkers have pondered the problem or subject long and deep enough to know what is truly essential. Karl Barth was once asked what he thought to be the most profound thought. He said, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Profound simplicity. Attitude is so important, attitude, and we have to consider that. He was the sort of man who would go after Moby Dick with a rowboat, a harpoon, and a jar of tartar sauce. That's attitude, baby. Henry Ford once said, those who say they can and those that say they can't are usually both right. Attitude, mental posture toward a problem, one feeling toward a problem, the angle or position of one's frame of reference toward a problem. That's very important when we deal with attitude. Attitude and aptitude. Aptitude, the ability to solve problems, both come from Latin word meaning to be fit. Our attitude drives our aptitude. If you don't have a positive attitude, thinking that God can help you and guide you and everything, you're going to go in there and you're going to have trouble. You really are. Okay, if you need to leave, that's fine. I'm flashing through this. A short statement is a principle based on long experience. Here are some principles. Challenge assumptions. Assumptions from limited information or looking at a problem from the wrong angle. Keep a broad perspective. The mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. Perspective is so critical. We must not become spiritually myopic. Don't get hooked. When your emotions dominate and flood your thinking, or when you're more concerned about your feelings than you are about the problem. Simple is better. The more complicated the problem, the greater potential for error. To simplify the problem, one must remove that which clutters up your thinking. Creativity is looking at whatever other people are looking at and seeing something different. Ask dumb questions. Anybody go to that? Yeah. At the core of problem solving is the ability to ask questions, and you must have the guts to ask dumb questions. Use the Columbo tact. Stand to reason. You remember Columbo? You mind if I ask you a question? You know, the Bible is a book full of questions. And so we've got all those. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? You know, what is truth? Where shall I go from your spirit? Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Am I my brother's keeper? For us, the great men are not those who solved the problems, but those who discovered them. And I would just end by saying a major portion of problem solving and conflict resolution, I'm convinced the work I've done with churches and the learning I've done over there is that a lot of times we're attacking the wrong problem. And we end up attacking people, and we take positions that are unhealthy. One of the best things we could do is develop the ability to discern and ask the right questions and decide what the real issue is and go from there. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for letting me spend time with you, and God bless you.